Estamos aqui hoje para conversar com o nosso querido professor Dr. Koyzis, David Koyzis, que escreveu essa belíssima obra que está na sua segunda edição. Eu tive o prazer de ler a primeira edição e trabalhar na primeira edição, e hoje estou com o prazer novamente dobrado de trabalhar a segunda edição deste livro aqui, que daqui a pouquinho a gente vai falar, que foi publicado aqui, ó, com a mesma capa da primeira edição, mas com acréscimos, etc. Daqui a pouquinho a gente vai falar sobre isso. Então é com muita alegria hoje que nós aqui da Vida Nova estamos felizes de você acompanhar conosco a conversa que teremos em poucos instantes com o Dr. Koyzis, que já está aqui conosco. Eu quero dizer que a Vida Nova está aí mais de 50 anos produzindo teologia, publicando livros, e é sempre uma alegria a gente poder divulgar os livros e poder fazer com que o máximo possível de leitores tenham acesso ao conhecimento. E uma dessas missões é cumprida, né, quando a gente traz o autor para conversar, como é o caso hoje da nossa conversa com o Dr. Koyzis, sobre o livro dele, Visões e Ilusões Políticas. Well, good to see you, David Koyzis. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Prazer.
Your Portuguese is better than my English.
Não é verdade. It's not so.
Okay, it's a pleasure. I'm so grateful for you to spend your time with us. And in the beginning, this conversation about the second edition of Political Visions and Illusions, yes. I would ask you about what's new in comparison to the first edition.
Right. Well, the first edition was, of course, written about 20 years ago. I started writing it around 1994, and then it was published in English in 2001. And since that time, over the last 20 years, a lot of things have changed. And I thought it was necessary to have a general update, because a lot of things have happened. We had, of course, the 9/11 attacks in New York City. We have had the crash of 2008, the economic crash of 2008, and so things needed to be updated. In the second place, while there was a bit of a change in the thesis of the book as well. So the first edition, I focus on ideology as an example of idolatry. But soon after I wrote it, I began to think it's not just a matter of idolatry, it's also a matter of a kind of story that's being told by the ideologies, a story about salvation and how we are going to bring about salvation through our own efforts. And so the second edition, that's one of the major differences between the first and the second edition. In the third place, I have written a concluding ecclesiological postscript. And that is about the role that the institutional church plays vis-a-vis political life. So that includes ministers from the pulpit. It includes ecclesiastical assemblies. How should we address political life from within the context of the institutional church? There are also discussion questions as well for each chapter. And then finally, I had to make some corrections because there were some mistakes in the first edition.
Well, when I read your book, I found this interesting passage that you said, "Those ringing the death knell for ideology are themselves in the grip of a worldview." Most of my students ask me always this question: what the difference between ideology and worldview? Does this distinction exist? If so, could you explain it?
Yes, indeed. Everybody is caught up in a worldview of some sort, cosmovisão in Portuguese. Everyone is caught up in a worldview, and it's based in a religious faith. So what do we put our faith in? We put our faith in the God who has revealed himself in Jesus Christ, or else we put our faith in something that God has created. And so there's no such thing as a person without faith. Atheists and agnostics will tell them they have no faith, but they do. They put their faith in something. It may be success, it may be material wealth, it may be a good sex life, perhaps, it may be any number of things that they are effectively worshiping. An ideology grows out of a worldview. So it's like the worldview is the soil, and then the ideology is like the plant that grows out of the worldview. And as a consequence, the major ideologies such as liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, what I call democratism, socialism, they are all rooted in some kind of religious worldview that animates their approach to political life.
Yeah. In part of this introduction, you said that every ideology has a religious root. I think this worldview is the same. But why has it been difficult for observers to see the religious roots of the ideologies, for example?
Because most people, at least in the Western world, and maybe this is true in Brazil and Latin America as well, tend to think that those people who have faith are only Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and others. And they think that if they are socialist, then or liberal or nationalist, that they are viewing things from a kind of neutral perspective, that they see things more clearly than everybody else, but they're not admitting that they have some kind of a faith that's animating their attitude towards nation or political participation or individual freedom. And so I think what we need to do is to try to get people to understand, okay, if you are conversing with me as a Christian, then you need to understand that you too have a religious faith. You may not be able to admit it, but it's there.
Yeah. In this book, you made a mention, Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism.
Yes, that's right.
And she said, all ideologies contain totalitarian elements. Totalitarianism is a worldview or is ideology?
Yeah, yeah. I think that Arendt is right. I have a special affection for Hannah Arendt. I wrote my master's thesis on her her thought about 40-some years ago, and I think she is very clear-sighted when it comes to understanding what the ideologies are all about. It's not just Hannah Arendt, but there are others, such as the late British political scientist Sir Bernard Crick wrote this book called In Defense of Politics, and he said basically the same thing, that all ideologies are potentially totalitarian. That is because the proponents, the followers of these ideologies, take one thing out of God's creation, and they focus on that, and that becomes effectively the idol that they're worshiping. And when you worship an idol, you want not only to make everything serve that idol, but you want everyone else to serve that idol as well. And if that means that you have to use totalitarian methods in order to achieve that, then so be it.
Yeah, when I read this book, I realized that you contrasted totalitarianism propensities with genuine or authentic pluralism. Could you explain it more?
Yeah. Pluralism is there's a word that I use that I don't think I made up in English, but it's called pluriformity. So I talk about the pluriformity of society, and that means that any differentiated society, a society such as Canada, the United States, Brazil, the United Kingdom, is made up of a multiplicity of communities in which we find ourselves embedded. So there are four main institutional communities: the state, the church institution, marriage, and family. And then there are many other communities as well, such as business enterprises, labor unions, schools, universities, chess clubs, football clubs, artist cooperatives, museums, and so forth. And all of these have their own place within society. And so the state under its divine mandate to do public justice, must undertake to try to protect that diversity of communities that we find in an ordinary society. And in some way, the political ideologies that I discuss in that book try to level out the differences amongst all of those communities, so that all communities, if you're a liberal, all communities then become a function of individual desires. And they don't have any status in their own right. They are simply the byproduct of individual desires. And therefore, every community becomes a voluntary association, even something like the state or the institutional church or marriage and family.
A short question. Is it the gospel and ideology?
Well, there are many people who would say that it is. And of course, we need to be very careful about that. I would say that basically it is not, because the gospel gives us a true account of God's world. It doesn't try to falsify God's world. It doesn't try to make everything serve individual freedom or human rights or the classless society. But at the same time, it is true that if Christians are not careful enough, they can get sucked into one of these ideologies, and they can endanger ordinary human societies and ordinary human life. So this is why I believe Christians need to be spiritually discerning. They need to exercise spiritual discernment as they evaluate these political ideologies.
Yeah, I made this question because many Christians ask me, Pastor, I can't participate with the left ideology or right ideology. What is the adequate for the Christians? You know?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I think, if many Christians are attracted to socialism, for example, because of its impetus in favor of helping the poor and the disadvantaged, because the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is filled with all sorts of commands that we are to help the poor, that we are to help the widow, the orphan, the fatherless, the sojourner or the stranger in the land. And that's something that makes many Christians gravitate towards socialism. On the other hand, the Bible also says that we are responsible as individuals for our standing before God. And so many Christians will say, well, in that case, maybe I want to follow some variety of liberalism. So each of the ideologies has a moment of truth. But it's at that very moment of truth that the ideologies go wrong, because they make it more than a moment of truth. They make it the whole truth. And that means that they are blind to truths where they may be found elsewhere.
Yeah. In your book, you show many different ideologies, but you show also your proposal for the solution for this conflict of the ideologies. You can explain about your proposal?
Yeah, that's right. And this is where my notion of pluriformity of authority comes in. And there are two principal Christian traditions that have been champions of this pluriformity. One is the tradition of Catholic social teachings, which go back as far as Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages. It goes as far back as Pope Leo XIII at the end of the 19th and the very beginning of the 20th centuries, with Rerum Novarum, which was a papal encyclical in 1891 on the condition of the workers, that talked about the need to protect workers within the context of the Industrial Revolution in Europe and elsewhere at that time. There is also the tradition of Neo-Calvinism that goes back to the Netherlands, but and also some of the borderlands between Germany and the Netherlands, and the idea of what Abraham Kuyper called sovereignty in its own sphere, in which every community would have its own sphere that needs to be protected, and businesses need to do what businesses do, families need to do what families do, raising children and providing loving environments to nurture children in. Church institutions need to do what they should be doing, to preach the word, to administer the sacraments, to maintain discipline among members of the church. A political party has its own place within the society as well. So that's, it's not so much that I'm proposing a series of political reforms. I'm simply, I'm proposing a change of heart, really, a change of heart, so that when we look at God's world, when we see ourselves acting within God's world, we recognize that it is God's world. It's not ours. It doesn't belong to us. And we ourselves don't belong to us. We belong to God.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
In the end of this conversation, I'd like to bring a verse of the Koyzis from the Rock, a poem of T.S. Eliot that wrote in 1934. And this wonderful verse said, "Our citizenship is in heaven. Yes, but that is the model and type for your citizenship upon earth." Dr. Koyzis, should pastors address political issues from the pulpit? When should a church congregation or denomination speak politically? If my son is being here now, he said to us, "Dad, the bomb has been planted."
Well, I think pastors and church congregations and denominations have to address politics, but they have to be very, very careful how they do so. And that's why I wrote this concluding ecclesiological postscript to the second edition. My book has been used in theological seminaries in North America and elsewhere, and for that reason, I thought it needed to be addressed. So it's very difficult. I don't think it would be wise for a pastor to get up in the pulpit and say, we need to have a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine problem. Or we need to have I'm going to use Canadian dollars, we need to have a $15 minimum wage implemented by our governments. That goes well beyond the proper competence and jurisdiction of a pastor. However, it is right for the pastor to preach from Scripture and say, we need to do justice. We need to do justice to the poor, to the oppressed, to the widow, the orphan, the sojourner. We need to look out for the people who are most vulnerable among us. A pastor ought to say this. A church congregation, a denomination ought to say that as well. And they need to teach the people in the pews the principles of what it means to do justice within not only political life, but all of life. So a husband does justice to his wife by being faithful to her. Parents do justice to their children by raising them to be good human beings, and for Christians to raise their children in the faith. That's doing justice to them. So justice is a part of all of life, and when we're addressing political life in particular, we need to be careful how we do so, but we cannot avoid doing so.
Yeah, Professor Koyzis, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about your book. I'm really grateful because I believe that your book is a great contribution for the Christians, thinkers in our context in Brazil. Thank you very much. I hope
you're very welcome
in future to see you face to face in Brazil again.
So. Yes,
you was in Brazil a long time ago.
Almost 5 years ago. Yes.
5 years ago. Yeah. Yes. But it's the first time. I think it's another opportunity to receive in our country again. Thank you very much.
Yes. Eu adoro o povo brasileiro. Que Deus abençoe o povo do Brasil.
Muito obrigado, Dr. Koyzis. E com isso, pessoal, nós encerramos aqui a nossa conversa, lembrando a você desta preciosidade. Não deixe de ler este livro, tem sido uma bênção aí para ajudar não só estudantes, mas todos aqueles que querem atuar na esfera pública. Dr. Koyzis foi abençoado por Deus com uma inteligência incrível, e esse livro aqui tem muita coisa para a gente estudar, muita coisa para a gente aprender. Que Deus abençoe vocês e até a próxima. Bye, bye. Tchau, tchau.
Tchau, tchau.